veramente felice di ospitare oggi insieme a tutto il dottorato la collega Graziella Tonon, innanzitutto perché è una grande amica, ci conosciamo da tanti anni, abbiamo fatto tante cose insieme nonostante siamo molto lontane, come avete visto, e io ho avuto l'opportunità di essere ospitata da lei in Argentina, a Buenos Aires, per delle lezioni al dottorato, e sono contenta di restituire questa opportunità anche se da lontano. Noi speriamo che possa venire fisicamente a Roma quanto prima.
Sì.
Graziella è full professor alla Facoltà di Scienze Sociali dell'Università Nacional de Lomas de Zamora in Buenos Aires, dove è anche direttore del centro di ricerca in social science all'Università di Palermo, che è un'altra grande università di Buenos Aires. Ha ricevuto un importante premio dalla International Society for Quality of Life Studies, Distinguished Service Award for the Substantial Contributing for a Better Understanding of Quality of Life Studies nel 2016. È fellow della Human Development and Capability Association di cui è stata anche segretario. Ed è stata, non so se lo sei ancora, vicepresidente per le pubblicazioni della International Society for Quality of Life Studies. Sì. Non ne faccio più parte, quindi non lo so gli aggiornamenti.
Sì.
È stata editor di diverse pubblicazioni e anche di riviste. Io vorrei citare la International Handbook of Quality of Life Series ed è stata associate editor della rivista Applied Research in Quality of Life Studies, entrambe della Springer. È anche direttore di una rivista, Journal of Ciencias Sociales dell'Università di Palermo. Tra l'altro poche settimane fa abbiamo festeggiato e celebrato questa rivista e sono stata anche invitata a questo evento con molto piacere. È autore di più di 30 libri, di 101 capitoli insieme ad altri quindi di libri collettanei e di 70 articoli scientifici sia in inglese che in spagnolo. Ha diretto 42 progetti di ricerca, hanno lavorato con lei 84 ricercatori, ha seguito 11 tesi di dottorato e 8 tesi di magistrali. Naturalmente ha partecipato a moltissimi convegni e conferenze intorno al mondo, sono 227 gli eventi a cui ha partecipato Graziella e questi eventi a livello internazionale, a livello nazionale ben 161. Ha lavorato per 25 anni come social worker, quindi assistente sociale, con bambini a rischio sia a livello di scuola primaria che anche a altri livelli, ma anche presso gli ospedali, presso i servizi sociali dedicati all'infanzia e anche come consulente dei tribunali dei minori. Quali sono i suoi campi di ricerca? Naturalmente la qualità della vita, l'approccio capabilities applicato al mondo dell'infanzia, metodi di ricerca qualitativa, tutti i temi riguardanti le comunità, l'educazione superiore, le disuguaglianze, le policy pubbliche e il lavoro sociale. Quindi diciamo con questi temi copre un po' tutti i vostri interessi, potremmo dire. Ci sarebbero ancora altre cose da dire anche riguardo alle cose che abbiamo fatto insieme, ma mi fermo qui e ringrazio ancora una volta Graziella per aver accettato di contribuire con questi 2 seminari al nostro dottorato e le lascio direttamente la parola.
Tante grazie, mia cara Filomena. Ok, we will start, we will have 2 days to work and we have time I will speak, and then another time where you will speak. So today we will begin with the first presentation. Yes? The theme of the whole seminar is public policy making for the improvement of quality of life, well-being, and human capabilities to overcome inequalities. We will have two sessions, the first one and the second one. In the first one, we will speak about the use of research results in public policy making for quality of life. And tomorrow we will speak about particularly inequalities. Okay. Well, first of all, we need to say that the last decades have revealed the role of politics in the research production, which may be understood as a chance that the research results must be taken into account and exert an influence on public policy decisions, oriented towards the people's lives improvement, though this does not always happen in practice. On that basis, we will study the possible ways in which research results may be reflected in the arena of political cycle by identifying its obstacles and its facilitators and proposing options to bridge the gap in order to improve quality of life. So let's start considering the possible transmission of research results to the field of public policy. The process of transmission of research results in the field of public policy reveals various peculiarities. So to analyze this process, we need first to reflect on the concept of public policy and also on the concept of quality of life. These two important concepts for today. We will speak first about quality of life. Well, quality of life is currently defined as a multidimensional concept comprising a number of domains that people consider and evaluate differently according to the importance they attach to each domain in their lives. This definition incorporates both a quantitative objective approach, this is to say, what people have and can be observed directly by us, and also a qualitative subjective approach, what people feel and can be observed indirectly. So quality of life becomes an outlook which includes both the traditionally called objective living conditions and the so-called subjective experiences, working on two levels, micro and macro, thus allowing the construction of a new outlook involving respect for human rights and integration of the more personal experiences to the political and community spheres. And what about public policy? Well, public policy, although traditionally have been designed in terms of the satisfaction of social or collective rights as an external activity and provided by the state, a change of focus has recently been promoted. Today, public policy needs to be focused on human rights, characterized by an attempt to construct a reflective capacity oriented to the development of a type of citizenship not merely involved in political state recognition, but also in a social culture recognition. The conception of public policy has seen an evolution in the past few years from the traditional perspective according to which decisions flow from the top downwards, with the designs dominating and determining the results, to the inclusion of the influence of other actors, apart from the government, in the definition of problems and the formulation of alternatives. But public policies depend on agreements and consensus at the level of the institutions or agencies involved in the process. Decisions about the public policies are often limited by dissent, political confrontations, or corruption agents. Public policies often hit some interest. Public or private actors could be damaged or displaced from business. Other times, they don't find the necessary balance between needs and resources. So our question is how to transmit the result of research on quality of life that are produced at the university or even at research centers to the public policy cycle. Well, we need to consider that research and policy can be conceptually distinguished by their goals and by their methods. Research fundamentally produces knowledge, and policy fundamentally produces change of practices. The transmission of research results in the scientific field has been traditionally conducted by the researchers in the presence of their peers, this is to say, another researchers, and all their students and postgraduate students. The 21st century calls for a further step in this line of work in order to secure the transference of those results to the field of public policy and for the improvement of people, population, quality of life. And what are the forms of knowledge productions? We need to study two dimensions of knowledge. The traditionally and strictly scientific and academic knowledge, all of us know about it, and another kind of knowledge that include the participation of social and political actors in the aforementioned production. This is not a traditional production of knowledge. It's a new one, particularly related to the different changes of the 21st century. But we need to remember some authors that 5 decades ago spoke about those topics. Yes? For example, Kaplan in 1979 that spoke about the conceptual use and the instrumental use of knowledge. The conceptual use of knowledge includes the gradual shifts in terms of policy makers' awareness and reorientation of their basic perspective, which involve important policy matters and are mostly associated with micro-level decisions. But the instrumental use of knowledge, that is the other one, is associated with micro-level decisions, that is to say, with the day-to-day policy issues, involving administrative policy issues pertaining to bureaucratic management and efficiency, rather than substantive public policy issues. Remember, this man said this 5 decades ago, yes? In the public policy circuit, the state has traditionally been an agent of organization and of institutionalization. Based on the establishment of rules and decisions originated in the public debate between the different agents and their demands or interests. However, the 21st century has witnessed innovative public policy proposals based on human rights, which allow for the possibility of a permanent interaction and adjustment in accordance with the situations and contexts in which individuals live. In drawing relationships between quality of life and public policies, Haggerty and his team 20 years ago have developed various criteria for determining the validity and usefulness of quality of life indexes to public policy, founded in the idea to help public policymakers develop and access programs at all levels of aggregation, having a clear practical purpose to be based on time series to allow periodic monitoring and control, and to be grounded in well-established theory. But to speak about the relation between research knowledge and public policy, first of all, we need to remember another pioneer work, the work of Caroline Weiss, entitled The Many Meanings of Research Utilization. Weiss' conclusion was that the time has come when importance must be given not only to an increase in the utilization of research results applied to political decision-making, but also to the increase and improvement of research contributions with political knowledge. 4 decades ago, the author I mentioned before, Crew and Young, say that there are 3 major dimensions to consider regarding the impact of research on public policy. First, the context. So, politics and institutions, which includes the interests of key policymakers and researchers, structures, and ideologies, they were limited by whether the policy changes were reformist or radical, how organizational pressures operated, and to what extent policies were adapted, developed, or when distorted when put into practice. This is the first dimension. The second one is evidence. This is to say credibility and communication, which implies investigating the impact of research findings, raising questions about the credibility of the research that has made some impact and the way in which it was communicated to policy makers. And finally, the third are the links. Yes, the links between influence and legitimacy, which are important to find out the identity of the key actors, their roles they have played, the links between them, and the extent to which the research methodology has given legitimacy to the findings. So, we need to reflect on what is the relationship between researchers and policymakers. The interrelations between researchers and policymakers have been considered a prime factor in analyzing knowledge transfer process to the public policy cycle. Analysis of the models of interrelations between researchers and policymakers is relevant when one realizes that the use of scientific knowledge depends largely on certain characteristics of the actors. That is to say, the researcher's behavior and the decision maker's receptiveness. We can also recognize that both researchers and policymakers have close personal links, with appropriate chains of legitimacy to those whom they represent. Researchers should have a higher influence, and policymakers could make better use of research. Policymakers, as well as researchers and academics, need to see eye to eye and take into consideration the social macro and micro dimensions in their daily tasks. So first we need to explain that there is a considerable difference between what researchers and policymakers consider to be knowledge and how that knowledge is developed or obtained. In other words, both groups have different approaches to the same issue. So how knowledge has been developed or obtained? Let's see. Researchers generally regard knowledge as something that is theoretically and methodologically defensible. Policymakers see knowledge as the result of an experience. Yes, two different points of view about knowledge. Nielsen recognizes three models of research used by policymakers. Research as data, research as ideas, and research as argumentation. In the case of research as data, it is something more mechanistic in terms of its application to the problem at hand. So I have this data, and when I make a decision, I take the data and nothing more. In the case of research as ideas, it is more general, applied to situations in which problems are regarded as complex in nature. It's closely related to some kind of point of view about the problem. And research as argumentation, this is very important for us to consider. It is used when a decision has already been made, so the policymaker has already taken the decision, and policymakers draw on research to take an advocacy position. So to sustain their position, they has some kind of situation as consider research as argumentation, yes? The goal of researchers is to advance science. They are interested in publications, in patents and professorships, and less interested really in social policy. But in the case of policymakers, they are more interested in solutions that can be generally applied to a wide variety of problems. And their goal is to obtain, obviously, popular support. Also, we can identify some differences between researchers and policymakers. For example, the aims each of them have, the vocabulary they use, the conception of truth, what is truth for a researcher and what is true for a policymaker, and the time they have. Researchers have more time to do all the projects, and policymakers have only little time, or only surgeon in their daily life. Well, researchers are persons who related to other persons. Thus, the product generated by those research processes are both socially and historically constructed. For researchers, their objects are not only objects for their observation, but also beings that possess their own pre-interpreted world and carry out their own observation. They are fellow creatures inserted in a social reality. Policymakers require quantitative and qualitative indicators to obtain the information they need. If they are to generate public policies that not only cater for the person's external living conditions, but also to their quality of life in multidimensional terms. In this matter, we coincide with Verhoeven, who expressed that public policies are not merely limited to material issues, but are also extensive to affairs related to people's mentality. Nobody has pointed out that governments frequently state that they would like to use credible and relevant research results to make informed decisions and to enrich their choices about public policy. However, the relationship between research and public policy design is really linear. Yes, it's very complicated. So then a question arises. Do policymakers use the research results because they really consider them useful, or because it is a way of defining responsibilities in the event of a possible failure in the decision they have taken? Yes, this is our question. So, it is important to remember that the differences between the interest of researchers and policymakers is that the former want to test their theories and are mostly anchored in a specific discipline, while the latter need to obtain solutions and require an interdisciplinary perspective on problems they have to solve. Likewise, an issue to consider is the fact of non-use or limited use of research results by policy makers. Glover identified four aspects of the policy-making process that were frequently incompatible with the utilization of social science research: policy objectives, timing of the decision, who takes the decision, and the decision-making process itself. In our own research, the results obtained show that policymakers need to be able to have available information transmitted in a precise and concrete way, that it does not take them too long to read it, and that fundamentally considers the conditions of the context. Likewise, this information has to be reliable and not put them at risk in terms of public credibility. For example, a detailed observation of the scene of decision-making in the field of public policy during the pandemic. All of you sure remember this. This allows to identify situations in which policymakers make decisions referring to research results, either to support, justify, or legitimize their decision. Our research reported that policymakers had specific suggestions to increase the use of research results in policymaking. Policymakers emphasized that research would be more helpful and useful if it included policy recommendations. They also mentioned the existence of limits on the use of research in policymaking, especially when there is an overwhelming amount of information provided in a format not easily accessed, considering the little time they have to take the decisions. So scientific research attempts to focus on the question so that a clear and crisp answer may be provided. Policymaking considers other variables such as interest, ideology, values, or opinions. Researchers and policymakers consider each other's activity as the act of generating products rather than is to be engaged in a process. So better policies are more likely to be implemented if the actors cooperate with each other and sustain their interactions over the time. So again, our question, can researchers and policymakers collaborate each other to solve the problem? If we speak about university research, we can say that this research is often unsuitable for the use of policymakers. It often takes much longer to produce results than a policymaker with a short deadline can tolerate. It is frequently highly critical without positive suggestion for action, in keeping with the self-image of many academics as gadflies. And it often avoids simple recommendations that can be acted upon and instead analyzes the advantage of various alternatives. So the research methods and techniques used is also another point to analyze. While many consider that a large amount of quantitative data and statistical analysis produces the only forms of reliable evidence for policymaking, however, statistics provide only one kind of scientific social evidence. The search for adequate statistics or best practices to address specific social problems goes hand in hand with a vision of the social sciences that can provide other answers, for example, using qualitative methods or mixed methods. It is therefore necessary to highlight the political nature of knowledge and, by extension, the political nature of collecting and presenting the evidence. The search for adequate statistics or best practices to address specific social problems goes hand in hand with a vision of the social sciences that can provide answers. Also, and if we see persons as the real protagonists of processes, then we must not only use quantitative indicators, which inform us of observable realities translated into figures, but we'll also need to rely on a qualitative approach, which can inform us of individuals' opinions, perceptions, and emotions, with due respect for their cultural particularities. The other issue to consider is the research quality. So, the rigorousness is the primary quality of characteristic which may help to determine the quality of a research. A rigorous research being the one that is free of fault in design, methods, and interpretation. Another common feature of the policy circuit is that policymakers tend to consult and engage with researchers they already know, either because they belong to the same political party, share political ideas, and or because they know them for personal reasons. Likewise, policymakers sometimes do not listen to or engage with researchers that lack the above-mentioned characteristics. And this is a problem, obviously. The other thing, very important, is the communication. One of the biggest impacts of research in policymaking is the communication of the results. So as researchers often communicate in ways that are too long and too complicated for policymakers, the policymakers can understand what the researchers are saying. We need to communicate in another way. Much more should be done to focus on the quality of how research is presented rather than just on the quality of the research. The two things are important, the quality of the research and the quality on how to communicate the result of the research. Again, remember the pandemic. Although in recent years there has been an intention on the part of researchers to participate directly in society, taking the interaction with policymakers in a more pragmatic way, the pandemic situation has strengthened this need. All of us can remember the situation with the meetings between the scientific persons and the policymakers. While the various models of policy processes that have emerged in this field demonstrate that there are many ways in which research may be influencing policy, it is widely recognized that the level of research utilization by policymakers is lower than it could be. So policymakers need knowledge that is intellectually credible and socially relevant. That is, they prefer concrete scientific results that provide practical solutions to concrete the problems. They need these kind of things. Policymaker requires the information supplied by quantitative and qualitative indicators if they are to generate public policies that not only cater for subjects' external living conditions, but also for their quality of life in multidimensional terms. In the case of researchers, it ought to be borne in mind that scientific arguments are important in policymaking, and that policymakers could make more constructive use of research, while researchers could communicate their findings more effectively in order to influence policymaking. A greater understanding of the policy context by researchers could increase relevance by focusing the research on more useful questions, collecting information instrumental to policy decisions, and improving the description of the research results and their implications. So, speaking about the actors of this process, Kane proposes a negotiation between theory and practice, and argues that to speak about theory and practice takes up rather common sense notion of what is done inside and outside of academia, and what is negotiated in the practical social, economic or political relevance of social sciences production on the one hand, and the implication of social experiences on the ground for theorizing on the other hand, the two things. Negotiating theory and practice means that academics must take responsibility for the result they bring to public debates, since this can serve as a guide for social action or produce decisions in relation to social action. Meanwhile, the experience and knowledge of non-academic actors and their responses to the theorizing of social sciences functions as a reality check for the theories held by academics. So let's focus now in the strategies to assist in increasing the use of research in policymaking. So, our strategies: making research findings more accessible to policymakers. Second, increasing opportunities for interaction between policymakers and researchers. Third, addressing structural barriers such as research receptivity in policy agencies and a lack of incentives to lure academics to link with policy. This is to say, highlighting the relevance of research to policy making. We need to remember that researchers and policymakers have different goals, needs different information, has different values, and use different languages. So the gap in communication between researchers and policymakers needs the dialogues and the writing, the two things, the dialogue and the writing. The quality of life research results transmitted to policymakers require possibility of access to the data, brief reports that contain the main results, and these reports need to be written in language to be understood by policymakers, not be complicated. To speak about writing, we need first to recognize that the research would be more helpful and useful if it included policy recommendations or implications. It is necessary to avoid the overwhelming amount of information provided in a format that is not easily accessed by policymakers, particularly considering the tight time frames policymakers have to take decisions. So, our recommendations: produce a document that provides responses to the needs of the current social, political, economic context, rather than focusing on issues that call our attention as researchers in terms of intellectual challenges, are important for us, but not perhaps for the policymakers. Use a simple language in this report and write a brief, clear, and precise document, please. So use graphics. They are very important for the policymaker. They can show only in a view the situation. Use photos of the different things you are speaking about. Are very representative. And use maps. It's very important for the policymakers to know the location of the different problems in a map. So the process is like this. First, make an initial contact with the policymaker. Then have a meeting. Begin with a meeting to know the situation and needs. In this meeting, you need to promote the dialogue and don't try to impose your point of view for responding to these needs. And finally, after policymakers read the report, perhaps new meetings will be held to discuss agreements and how to continue working together. It's not a complex process, it's a simple process, step by step, but we need to do the things like this. So to conclude, policymakers as well as researchers need to see eye to eye and take into consideration the social macro and micro dimensions in their daily tasks. To share the result of quality of life research findings with policymakers has become an urgent need for the building of good societies. With the right level of interaction between researchers and policymakers, the translation of research findings into actionable policy and programmatic vida is an achievable goal we can reach to improve the quality of life of the population. And finally, I want to remember a textual of one of the reports of social sciences by Felicia Schneider. They say that connecting research and policymaking is a two-pronged process, encouraging policymakers to become more research-minded and encouraging researchers to become more policy-minded. So this is the book, Key Actors in Public Policy Making for Quality of Life, Facilitators and Obstacles. Have near 2 years, was published in 2022 by Springer in a special series entitled Human Wellbeing Research and Policy Making. Yes, this is the information of the book, so I think you can read it in your library of the university.